Kuzuzangpo, welcome to Bhutan e-learning program. This is a biology lesson for Key Stage 5, that's for classes 11 and 12. I'm Mahendra Timsina from Deshincholing Higher Secondary School. Have you ever imagined how our life would be without hormones? We studied about hormones before. We know hormones as chemical messengers of our body, and they are important in many aspects, like maintaining our physiological, physical, as well as mental well-being. So how would our lives be if hormones were not there? Or can you think what would happen if one particular hormone in our body is less? We have that ability to maintain our internal body environment. There's a term called as homeostasis. We know homeostasis as a process by which we maintain our internal environment in a balanced manner. So for that purpose, hormones play a very important role. There are different factors which influence activities that occur in our body. When I say activities, I'm talking about growth, reproduction, and other processes. If we take one particular example, temperature or body temperature. Body temperature has to be in a certain range. Similarly, there are set points for different factors. Like we say, the normal body temperature comes in the range of 35 to 40 degrees Celsius. So that is a sort of set point of body temperature. And hormones play an important role in maintaining that. It is not just the body temperature. Apart from that, there are other factors like the glucose level in our body. Similarly, pH of our body. Every other parameters has certain set points, and hormones are really important for maintaining the set points of various parameters of our body. So to understand more, in this lesson, we are going to study about feedback mechanisms in our body. More focus will be paid on the roles of hormones in maintaining the body activities and also the processes through feedback mechanism. By the end of the lesson, you should be able to explain feedback mechanism, relate feedback mechanisms as a process to maintain homeostasis. State some examples of hormonal controls so as to support feedback mechanism. And ultimately, you should be able to identify the significance of feedback mechanism to human. So let us look at feedback mechanism. Feedback mechanism as a loop or a kind of cyclic process which responds to certain change, be it outside our body or inside our body. The system responds to change and accordingly brings in change so as to adapt to the surrounding changes or internal changes. Or it also keeps a balanced internal environment. So there are different types of feedback mechanisms in our body. One good example of feedback mechanism can be regulation of our body temperature. So let us see how our body deals with when there is increase and decrease in body temperature. First one, when the body temperature increases, when it goes above the normal temperature level, The thermoreceptors will sense the increasing temperature and it will initiate some processes by involvement of some hormones. So because of the increased temperature and that system of regulation, it will cause dilation of blood vessels, due to which more blood will go to the surface of our body. The heat from internal part of the body is carried to the surface and then heat is lost to the surrounding. It also initiates sweating. When water moves out of the body, along with other substances, it also carries heat away from the body, which will bring down the body temperature. Whereas in the second case, when body temperature decreases, when it comes below the normal level, now it is important for the body to maintain or retain heat inside. So for that purpose, whenever the temperature decreases, it will lead to contraction of blood vessels, especially on the surfaces of our body, the outer surfaces. And when that happens, blood flowing to the surfaces will decrease, due to which the heat loss is decreased. Similarly, sweating is minimized. It will also initiate the shivering action. When body shivers, it will lead to generation of heat and the body temperature is increased. That brings the body temperature to a normal level. So that was a simple way of understanding how feedback mechanism actually helps in regulation of body temperature. Feedback mechanism or a feedback loop functions because of its components or certain factors. So if we'll have to look at the components, first one is stimulus. The second one, sensor or the receptors. Third one, the integrator. And the fourth one, the effector. The first one, stimulus. Stimulus can be defined as change in the environment or a change inside the body. So any change will initiate the feedback mechanism. For example, increase in body temperature can be considered as a simple stimulus which will cause that process of regulation. The second one, the receptors or the sensors. There are different receptors in our body, like thermoreceptors, which detect the change in temperature. Similarly, chemoreceptors, which detect the change in the chemical composition of different fluids in our body. The third one, integrator. Generally, central nervous system plays a major role as integrator because modulates the information coming from the sensors or the receptors to the central nervous system. And the last one, it is the effector. Effectors are various types of organs, like sweat gland can be considered as one example of effector. So whenever impulse comes from the central nervous system, the effector will produce something or carry out some reactions which will bring the body back to normal. To move on, feedback mechanisms or feedback loops are of two types. The first one, the positive feedback mechanisms, and the second one, the negative feedback mechanisms. In our body, for regulating various types of activities, most of the feedback mechanisms occurring are of negative type. You will know why as we study the details. The first one, the positive feedback mechanism. A positive feedback loop or mechanism enhances a particular stimulus, or it leads to increase in the rate of a particular process. So for example, again, let us take this process here, the birth process. Just before birth, the child inside the uterus changes the orientation, and the head moves down towards the cervix. And once it moves down towards the cervix, the head applies some pressure on the cervix. That pressure is stimulus. Once the pressure is exerted on the cervix, the pressure receptors there sense the stimulus, and impulse is taken to the central nervous system. And through modulation, impulse goes to the pituitary gland, which will produce oxytocin. Oxytocin is carried down to the uterus, and once it reaches the uterine muscles, it will initiate contraction of the uterine muscles. Further, it will also cause increase in the production of oxytocin. So that is one simple way by which we can understand a positive feedback mechanism. We always talk about adrenaline rush. Adrenaline is a hormone that is produced by adrenal glands. Adrenal glands are also called as suprarenal glands. They are located on the top of kidneys. Adrenaline is known for a positive feedback. It is produced during stress. That's why it helps us to deal with emergencies. We also call adrenaline as fight or flight hormones. So if you look here, you can see during a stress response, adrenaline is produced during stress. So whenever there is a stress can be one stimulus. So during a stress, let us say the stimulus is perceived by our eyes, and impulse goes to our brain. Brain will give another impulse to the pituitary, which will produce ACTH, that is adrenocorticotropic hormones. Those hormones, when they go down to the adrenal gland, they will cause production of cortisol and importantly adrenaline. Adrenaline leads to some physiological changes. For instance, increase in heartbeat, increase in breathing rate, increase in blood pressure. You see, a simple stimulus, that is the stress, caused increase in certain processes of our body. So we can say that as a simple positive feedback mechanism which occurs in our body. So that was all about the positive feedback mechanism. Now let us look at negative feedback mechanism or a negative feedback loop. Negative feedback mechanism, when it occurs, it leads to a decrease in the rate of a certain process, or it brings certain parameters, certain factors of our body to a normal level, that is, to a stable condition. So it is known for bringing the body to a normal state after the body has undergone some changes. That's why most of the feedback mechanisms occurring in our body are of negative type. A simple example can be regulation of blood sugar concentration. So in regulation of blood sugar concentration, there are hormones involved. Let us look at this image here. Normal blood glucose level is about 90 milligrams per 100 milliliter of blood. Right after meal, there is an increase in the blood glucose level. So when there is an increase in blood glucose level, the beta cells in the islets of Langerhans of pancreas will produce insulin. Insulin initiates some processes, like it will increase the cellular respiration, due to which more glucose is taken up by cells. It will also increase a process called as glycogenesis, in which glucose is converted to glycogen and stored in liver. So more glucose from blood moves to liver and it is converted to glycogen. Similarly, it will also increase the uptake of glucose from the blood by muscle cells. Due to that one, blood sugar level or blood glucose level is brought back to normal. The second condition, when blood glucose level comes down or it is lower than the normal concentration, then the alpha cells in the islets of Langerhans of pancreas will produce another hormone called as glucagon. Glucagon is antagonistic to insulin, which means it will reverse the processes that was initiated by insulin. So it will cause glycogenolysis, which means breakdown of glycogen occurs. So glycogen is converted to glucose and it is transported to blood. Second one, it will also decrease the rate of respiration, due to which uptake of glucose from the blood by the cells is decreased. Similarly, it will also decrease the uptake of glucose by the muscles, due to which more glucose will accumulate in the blood and blood glucose concentration will come back to normal. So that was one simple way to understand how hormones affect or how hormones initiate changes in order to bring our body to a normal condition. Let me clarify one myth. Generally, people believe that positive feedback is good for our body, whereas negative feedbacks are not very good. It is important to be clear that both positive as well as negative feedbacks are important for our body. In fact, most of the feedback mechanisms occurring in our body are of negative type because they help our body to come back to normal condition. So that was all about the positive and negative feedback mechanisms. Now let us look at hormones and how they influence various types of body processes. First one, the menstrual cycle. In females, there is a monthly cycle called as menstrual cycle. To understand menstrual cycle, we need to understand changes occurring at two places. Firstly, in the endometrium of uterus, and the second one in the ovary, where oogenesis occurs. Both the changes in the endometrium as well as ovaries, they are initiated by hormones. Menstrual cycle has 4 phases. The first phase, it is the menstrual phase, where a female discharges the menstrual fluid. After that, the second phase is called as proliferative phase, where the endometrium grows. Proliferative phase is also called as follicular phase because in the ovaries the follicles grow. The third phase, it is called as ovulation phase. And the last phase, it is called as secretory phase. The fourth phase is also called as luteal phase because in the ovaries, after ovulation, there is formation of corpus luteum. Now let us relate the menstrual cycle to feedback mechanism. To do that, let us take two phases. Firstly, the ovulatory phase. During ovulatory phase or just before ovulatory phase, there is an increase in the level of estrogen. The increase in the level of estrogen causes the increase in the level of LH, that is luteinizing hormone. And we call that as LH surge. So that occurs just before the ovulatory phase. So because of the increase in luteinizing hormone, it will cause release of the ovum from the Graafian follicle. So that is one simple mechanism, a positive feedback mechanism. Whereas after that, a negative feedback mechanism occurs. So right after ovulation, there is an increase in progesterone because in the luteal phase, the size of corpus luteum increases, which will produce more progesterone. And progesterone causes a negative feedback mechanism. When there is more progesterone, it will lead to decrease in other hormones like estrogen and luteinizing hormones because there's no need of those hormones now. So that is a negative feedback mechanism occurring during the menstrual cycle. You have on the screen a simple representation of menstrual cycle. The first phase, that is menstrual phase, occurs in around the first 7 days. And after that is follicular phase, which continues till the 13th day. And the 14th day, the third phase occurs, that is ovulatory phase. And after that, it is the luteal phase that occurs from the 15th day till the 20th. It also has an additional information. You see, out of the phases, especially if you look at the 8th day till 16th day, the phases in these particular days of the menstrual cycle, the chances of conception of child is very high. So that's all about the image. Prior to menstruation, female experience a little change in the body physiological state. And they show some symptoms which we generally group them together to call as premenstrual syndrome. At this phase, females generally experience cramps, headache, irritation, fatigue and all. And also they show a lot of psychological changes. So some tips to deal with premenstrual syndromes are: take balanced diet, carry out regular exercise, refrain from taking caffeine, cigarettes, alcohol, and also get enough sleep. Negative feedback mechanism can also be observed in production of testosterone. So during puberty, the hypothalamus releases one hormone called as gonadotropin releasing hormone or gonadotropin releasing factor, which will cause the pituitary, the anterior part of pituitary, to produce two hormones, that is luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. So if you look at the diagram, you can see luteinizing hormone will go and influence the interstitial cells to produce testosterone, whereas follicle stimulating hormones will stimulate the seminiferous tubules, leading to spermatogenesis. Once spermatogenesis occurs, the high amount of sperm will cause the production of inhibin, and the high amount of testosterone will give one negative impulse to the hypothalamus, which will cause some changes and which will decrease the production of testosterone, which means testosterone is not required at a very high amount, because of which when a little amount of testosterone is produced, one negative feedback mechanism occurs, which will decrease the further production of testosterone. So that's all about the negative feedback mechanism in human. Now let us look at what happens if certain feedback mechanisms fail to operate, or at times of dysfunction of some of the organs, what happens to the body? So let us take a simple example of pancreas, or let us say what happens when feedback mechanism leading to regulation of blood sugar concentration doesn't work well. It leads to a condition called as diabetes mellitus. We know during diabetes mellitus, it is characterized by a constant increase in the level of blood glucose concentration. So when a person has higher level of blood glucose concentration on a regular or on a constant manner, then the person experiences some symptoms like feeling weak, drowsiness, blurred vision, and also frequent urination, and also frequent thirst. There are two types of diabetes mellitus. The first one is called as insulin dependent diabetes mellitus, or diabetes mellitus type 1, and the second one is called as diabetes mellitus type 2, that is non-insulin dependent diabetes mellitus. So if you look at a figure here, what we see is in type 1 type of diabetes mellitus, due to some problem with the pancreas, there is decreased production of insulin, and due to which the amount of insulin in the blood is very less, and when that happens, the blood glucose level goes high, it increases. Whereas in second case, there's no problem with the production of insulin. The amount of insulin produced is normal, and the concentration of insulin in the blood is also normal. However, the insulin, when they reach the cells, the target cells do not receive it. The receptors are having some problem with detecting insulin, due to which uptake of glucose by the cells is minimized, and the blood glucose level increases. And that is the type 2 type of diabetes. Now, if you look at both the mechanisms, we see in one case there's a problem with insulin production. In the second case, there's a problem with the receptors. But if we compare, what we see is both the cases, the feedback mechanism is not occurring in a proper manner, which is causing an increased concentration of glucose. So that is what happens when there is some problem with a feedback mechanism. So that was all about the feedback mechanism. Now, before coming to our questions, let me give you one clarification again. There's a common myth that people suffering from diabetes should not take food with high sugar content or sugary food. It is not like that. People can take, however, it should be planned properly. The amount should be planned, and a balanced diet could help the person to deal with. So that's all about the lesson. Now let me leave you some questions that will help you understand feedback mechanisms more. The first one, can you try answering how is positive feedback mechanism different from the negative feedback mechanism? And try using some examples while explaining. The second question is, we have seen as a process, as a method of family planning, people consume birth control pills which contain some hormones. And these hormones influence the menstrual cycle actually. So can you see if that is a wise alternative of planning? And the last one, there is one general idea that eating more sugar causes diabetes. So can you do a literature research to see if this statement is actually true? That was all about the lesson. We have come to the end of the lesson now. Thank you for paying attention. Thank you.